All right, so today we're going to go over a very expedited lesson about flowing. Flowing is the way in which you keep notes in around. So rather than just jotting down all your ideas in whatever way feels natural to you, we have this very predetermined manner in which we do things that makes it a lot easier to actually use the notes within a debate sense, because we want to keep our thoughts organized. That way we know exactly what we're going to say when we go up into our next speech, because you're going to bring your flow up whenever you give your speech, and that's going to be really all you have to guide yourself. You might have some evidence that you're prepared to read, but for the most part, you're going to be looking at your flow to know what to say next, especially under arguments where you don't actually provide any evidence and you're just giving general ideas and thoughts and responses to your opponent's arguments that don't actually bring up evidence. So flowing is by far one of the most critical skills in debate, and it's okay if it's a bit unique in whether or not you have your own turns on it. It doesn't have to be exactly the same as the way I do it, because mine is definitely sloppy and not the best. But the fact that you understand the basic ideas behind flowing is one of the most critical things in debate. So without further ado, all we're going to do on this video is I'm going to go through and I'm going to show you kind of how flowing will work as the round goes on, give you the basic idea behind it, and then at the end we'll go through and I'll show how the flow can help you understand everything, and I'll explain the round based only on my flows. So let's get right into it. So first thing you're going to do is you're going to have your two pieces of paper and you're going to have two different pens, and we'll get to why we have two different pens in a moment. But whenever you're flowing, you're going to want to keep things in for the very first speech in the very left column, which obviously right now this looks kind of gross, but that's how we're going to start. So during the first affirmative speech, you're going to flow their basic ideas into the very left column. Now, you're not just going to flow whatever you might think is important. I mean, that's somewhat what you're doing, but you're going to do it in a more organized manner as well, because there's a couple things that you definitely need to get, and it's nice if you're able to find it whenever you read the flow. So the three things that we need to focus on mainly are value, criterion, and contention. So I like to separate these with some quick markings. I personally use a V in a circle, a VC in a circle, and a C and then a number in a circle for the value, criterion, and contention. Obviously, if there are multiple contentions, the first one will be contention 1, so C1, the second one will be contention 2, C2, and so on and so forth. Also, if they have subpoints, I'll put SA for subpoint A, SB for subpoint B, and so on and so forth on that as well. So that's just our basic getting our information in. Then there's also a bit more information that we want to get, such as the cards, the actual pieces of evidence that our opponent reads. So for that, I use another marking mechanism. I write the author's last name and also the date if provided, and assuming I catch it, because sometimes the date just goes in one ear out the other and you don't get time to write it down. And I draw the little half square, half rectangle. That way I can mark that it's a piece of evidence, and if I'm looking, I can say that's where the evidence is. So those are the basic things that you need to get down. But honestly, more importantly, is just the ideas behind the arguments. So obviously getting the value, criterion, and contentions are the most essential things, but then you want to get the big ideas from those points. So obviously here with the value and value criterion, there's very little actual information that we need. Right above this Velasquez evidence, we have a little part about actual social groups and how they're going to falter without societal justice. But for the most part, there's not too much to say. However, under our contentions, we have a bit of notes. Now, I'm keeping my notes very brief because as I've been debating for years now, I'm able to know exactly what I'm thinking of with just a few words. But as you first start, it's definitely okay to put a lot more words on here, but you want to keep it nice and brief, using your own shorthand or whatever you need to make sure that you're not writing too much, because although it looks like there's a lot of this paper that's not being used, we're going to definitely add on to this later. So big things to remember is to use your little markings. That way you know what you're looking for. So if you want to look for the first contention, you can just be bam, right there. You also want to keep it in the left column, and you want to use a distinctive pen color. So I like to use blue for the affirmative, and we'll explore why right now. So whenever we move on to our next speech, we're going to now utilize a second piece of paper and a second pen. So ignore this left piece of paper for a second. If we look over here, it looks like we're doing the exact same thing we just did, but this time with the negative speech. Notice that the negative speech is in the red pen. This is because the blue pen is going to be reserved solely for what the affirmative side says, and the red pen is going to be reserved for what the negative side says. Additionally, our papers differ where this one on the left is based off of the affirmative speech, or the affirmative case. Of course, the negative side is going to things in response to the affirmative case, so that's still going on this paper, even though it was not said by the affirmative. Similarly, this paper is going to be reserved for the negative case, and even when the affirmative responds to it, even though the negative did not say those arguments, it's still going to go over here because it's about the negative case. So, but otherwise, this is exactly like what we just did over there. Sure, it's a little shorter because the negative case is shorter than the affirmative, but we still have our basic information and our little notes that we need to follow around. However, we have new ideas over here on the affirmative case, because now, if you remember, after the negative side gives their case, they then move on to addressing the affirmative's case in the rebuttal. So whenever they do that, we're going to go through and we're going to draw little arrows from whatever argument we're responding to, and we're going to write what the response is. This one up here is a little weird on my part because the argument is addressing two things, and then it also makes two different arguments. So I kind of have it come through to say these are arguing the same point, and also there's two arguments. So that one's a little weird and abnormal, but that was for a reason. But most of the time it's just going to look like this. You have your little arrow, and then this is what we're responding to. Sometimes they're just responding to the big idea, such as here, we're just responding to the entire contention. Sometimes they're responding to specific pieces of evidence, like here with Asia in 2012, where it's responding to the specific cited card. But just in general, you want to write down everything your opponent is saying, or what you're saying if you're the one about to give the rebuttal, and you're going to draw the arrows from whatever they're talking about to the actual response. And the reasoning behind this is that it makes the argument super easy to follow. So if you're thinking, well, what has happened on the racial minorities argument, then we can go, here's the first contention, and then we can read what they first said, and then we're going to be like, well, what responses were made to that? And then we can just look to the right, and bam, there's all the responses. And then those responses are going to go there, and they're going to be marked with them, and so on and so forth. So it makes it really easy to see everything that's happened under the argument. On that note, let's move on to after the next speech. So after the 1AR, we're going to see similar trends, but now it's all responses. So the affirmative side draws their little notes there, and they make their responses on the value and value criterion, and then the contentions and all the points, and we just have our arrows again. There's really not too much more to add on this, except for that obviously we're seeing more and more argumentation, and we're going to continue to see both papers used as well as the affirmative side using their own color. Now that it's the affirmative side talking again, we are back in blue. And then, of course, we do it again with the negative side. Once again, everything is pretty much the same here, except for now we have these little things over here, which is our key voter issues. In this case, there's just one, and it's very minimal. Because whenever I was writing this, honestly, I didn't really need too much for this voter issue because it wasn't that in-depth. It was just kind of really big ideas. But I generally keep it just to the right, or sometimes down here if I need it. This flow is very minimal. A lot of times you'll have more information on it, but wherever you put the key voter issues doesn't really matter. I've done on backs of papers before, simply because I had so much going on in the round that I didn't have space over here or down here to do it. But this will just be your general notes about what you're going to say with your key voter issue. These are much less scripted and much less organized because no one's going to come up and respond to your key voter issues. Once you're writing it down, it's the last thing you're going to say. So if you're on the negative side, you don't have to worry about what the affirmative side's going to say in their next speech because it's your last speech. No matter what they say, you can't say anything about it, so there's no point of really taking notes about it. And on the affirmative, similarly, it's the last speech of the round. There's not going to be another one, so there's no real need to worry about your opponent saying anything about it. And even if you're on the affirmative side, when the negative is getting their key voter issues, it doesn't really matter to you. You're not going to go up there and attack their key voter issues. So what they're just making is claims for their judge, but it'll be fine on your end. So we don't really need to organize it in this place where it's going to be easy to flow. We just need to make sure that we're getting down whatever ideas we need for whenever we give our voter issues. And then lastly, we see the affirmative side is going to do a similar thing and give their key voter issues. This time there's two of them, which obviously is just marked with another key voter issue and a little spiel of text. So on that note, that's really just the basics of flowing. This is definitely something that you should run a lot of drills with because there's a lot that goes into flowing, such as being able to write fast and get down the ideas and be able to organize it. Because the round is going to go at what at what speed the round wants to go. And if you miss ideas or if you don't put it in a way that's easy to see, then your whole flow is going to be like compromised. So saying that you should practice a lot before you go into round, mainly just by like listening to you, like someone read a case to you and then trying to flow it. But let's quickly go through and I'll show you how like even these small notes are enough to help me know what's going on in the round. So first, starting with the first affirmative constructive, which is our first blue column over here, we see that they provide the value of societal justice and they support it with a card from Robinson in which they simply define what societal justice is. Then under the value criterion, which is resisting oppression, resisting is shown by a little down arrow because it's like reducing, and then OPP is oppression. That's my like shorthand for it. They provide two pieces of evidence. The first is going to be cut in, I believe that says 2016. Where no, that's no date on that at all. But it's from Professor Cudd, and they just define it again. And then they have another point under it where they talk about under Velasquez how societal justice is the basis for the foundation of social groups, and without it, these social groups are going to falter, and society as a whole will do the same. Then they get into contentions. The first contention is about racial minorities and how a federal jobs guarantee would help them. First, they provide a piece of evidence under Paul 2018 that says that employment is currently really low, and then another piece under Asia 2012 where they said that the federal jobs guarantee will increase employment for these groups. They provide specific examples as well from like India and Argentina. And then lastly, under that, they specifically talk about how black women are being hit hardest right now under their Holder in 2020 card. Lastly, they move on to their second contention wherever they talk about how working is a human right. First, they say that just because something is costly doesn't mean that it's like not important under their Chernerva 20 evidence. And then lastly, they say it is a human right under the Fogarty 2015 evidence. So that is the affirmative case. Now moving on to the negative constructive and their rebuttals. First, in their case, they build similar ideas. They give a value of morality, value criterion of maximizing well-being, supported by Professor Harris. And then they talk a little bit about pragmatism, about how morality is linked to pragmatism, and use Stolberg as their evidence to support that. Then moving on to our first contention, they talk about how the economy is going to be hurt by a federal jobs guarantee, specifically by a rise in taxes shown under Golker in 2018, and how businesses are going to be harmed and have to raise their prices under the Taylor in 2018 evidence. And then they respond to the affirmative case, first under the value and value criterion. They say that they should prefer the negative value and value criterion because it's more holistic and it encompasses these big ideas of societal justice and minimizing oppression, as well as other ideas. Beyond that, they also said that if you prefer the value and value criterion of societal justice and resisting oppression, they're still achieving those better anyway for reasons that they'll get into on the contentions. Moving on to contentions, they see that they're not actually going to be reducing first they said actually that they're going to be harming racial minorities due to the rise in taxes and prices, which is going to just make it to where we're going to see more working poverty instead of people actually like escaping poverty, which is the point of doing this. Even if they have a job, they're not escaping poverty. They also said that their examples that they provided about reducing poverty doesn't really apply because they're too small scale. They didn't affect the entire nation. It was just small groups of people. And lastly, under the second contention, they talked about how they're not actually going to be achieving this right because people are still going to be in poverty, which is really what the human right is talking about. The human right isn't about employment itself, it's about poverty. Next, in the affirmative speech, we are going to start on this, the affirmative case, or the negative case, although it doesn't really matter. So first, addressing morality and maximizing well-being, they said once again that you should prefer theirs due to the fact that whenever we achieve, we lose justice, it's going to destroy our social groups, which was what they said in their Velasquez evidence from earlier that wasn't really addressed by the negative side. Then on their point about pragmatism, they say that it is pragmatic and it's entirely possible, so that point doesn't really matter. Next, on their first contention about the economy, they said first under the rising taxes that we're not going to actually pay for it by taxing people. We're actually just going to pull the cost from welfare because now less people are on welfare. Additionally, they said that even if we do have to tax people, we can simply tax the rich instead of the poor people, so they're not going to be harmed. Then under the point where we talk about how they're going to be harming businesses, we see that they're simply saying that they've been fine in the past. Like whenever we've increased minimum wage, they haven't seen meaningful increases in the actual costs of goods, and we're not going to see it here. And then lastly, under the affirmative case, they simply cross-applied their arguments that they made under the value and value criterion over there. And then whenever in response to the point by their opponent, where they said that they're going to see taxation and inflation, so it's not going to help racial minority groups. They said we already proved that that wasn't the case. Under the point about how the examples are too small scale, they said that these were super poor nations, and if poor nations can pull them off, such as India and Argentina, then we could surely do it here in the United States. And lastly, on their point about human rights, we see that it can only be solved on the affirmative side. They claim due to the fact that they need the autonomy of choice, not just the welfare to be supporting them in order to achieve this human right. And now, lastly, moving on to the negative arguments, starting on the negative side, they say that they're going to achieve the value of societal justice and minimizing oppression anyway, so it doesn't really matter if the affirmative side wins it. And then their point about pragmatism, they said that's not pragmatic because it costs too much on the economy. They said that whenever they talk about pulling money from welfare, they're saying that this is actually going to harm people on welfare anyway, so it's not going to be worthwhile. We're still going to see the economy harmed. And whenever they said that we can simply tax the rich, they're saying that that's still going to have effect on people due to the fact that the cost is simply just going to trickle down to the lower class. Next, on the point where they talked about how businesses are going to be fine because they have in the past, they said that that's only because they've had to increase their wages by small amounts, not huge amounts, which is what we're going to see under the federal jobs guarantee. Next, moving on to affirmative case, they simply did cross-applying on the value and value criterion. They said under the point about racial minorities that you can once again cross-apply the arguments that we saw on taxes, and that whenever they say that it's a good example because these nations are poor nations and therefore the United States can support it, they said that the issue there is that they didn't actually have to guarantee it to all their citizens, only to small groups, which is where the difference is made. And lastly, on the point about rights, they said that once again, we're not actually going to be solving these rights due to the fact that they currently have autonomy with the welfare system, and they even have a system that supports them because they can choose to go and find a job and search for, even if it's hard, they can search for a job if they want. I am not going to go over the key voter issues because I've already definitely just been rambling with this enough, but you can see how even these small notes definitely give me what I need to do to go through the entire round and tell you what happens. Obviously, these are my own bits of shorthand, and you can choose your own because you want it to be what makes sense to you. But these basic ideas can be applied to simply better know what's going on in the round and then guide yourself in your speeches. So, but otherwise, there's really not too much else to say about flowing except for you need to practice, practice, practice. So, as always, I hope this video was educational, and I wish you guys luck in all your rounds.